When is the right time to sell a stock? How do you protect against inflation? Financial decisions can be tricky, and often your own cognitive and emotional biases can lead you astray. Financial Decoder, an original podcast from Charles Schwab, can help. Join host Mark Reby as he offers practical solutions to help overcome the cognitive and emotional biases that may affect your investing decisions. Listen at schwab.com/financial decoder.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code Wondery for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code Wondery at checkout.
One of the things that I had said, which was most important to me, and this is across the board, is that when a child is born and a child is young, they look to us for everything, for protection, for food, to hold them when they're sick. And these people violate that trust that's given to these children. And they take away, they give us a life sentence. I mean, he might have got 8 years, but he gave us all a life sentence. And that was just something from the heart that I needed to get out. And you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. All 6 of the FBI agents that helped us were in the courtroom at that time too. It was really a surreal setting. And Tommy just gave his impact statement about, how he would take him to New Jersey and what he did and how horrible he was. And, how my nephew has been suffering from PTSD ever since. Luckily I've come out of it pretty sane, although a few of my friends wouldn't say that.
That's Bob Aellis, an advocate who is working to fight child exploitation. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Bob Aellis grew up in an apartment in Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s with his father, mother, and older brothers, William and Tom. After graduating from high school, Bob enlisted in the Navy as his brothers had before him and eventually came home, took a job at the telephone company, and began to build his family. But Bob was carrying a secret, one that he had only shared with his high school girlfriend up until that point. For years, since he was a child, his older brother William had been sexually abusing him. Bob opened up to his wife and would later find out that his nephew Tommy, his cousin Paul, were also abused. He would find out later that others in the neighborhood had been abused by William. As the years went by, Bob would discover clues that suggested his mother may have known about the abuse and stood silent about it while it was happening and afterwards for dark reasons that were and continue to be hard to comprehend. More than 50 years after first being abused by William, Bob, his brother, nephew, and cousin, would discover that William, now in his late 70s, was continuing to prey on children. Often, we talk about how criminals begin to slow down as they get older, and one of the exceptions, according to the data, are child sex abusers. They discovered that William was fantasizing about a 4-year-old child in the Boca Raton, Florida neighborhood where he lived, and was planning a trip to Disney World and 2 other theme parks to target children. Bob and his other family members, at great risk to them, set up a reverse catfishing operation where they pretended to be interested in child pornography and child sexual abuse to lure William into confessions and transmitting child pornography to an account that was eventually taken over by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their efforts led to William's arrest, confessions to the FBI, and a federal conviction on charges of possession of child pornography in the Southern District of Florida. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida's office had worked out a plea agreement with William for him to spend 5 years in prison. Bob and his abused family members were given the opportunity to share their stories of abuse, despite the fact that William was not charged with it because of the statute of limitations, which had passed on those cases decades before. When the judge, Robin Rosenberg, heard the statements, she took the unusual step of stepping off the bench and returning to sentence William to 8 years instead of the 5 that had been agreed upon. It was near the maximum that she could. Bob has now become a victim's advocate and is sharing his story so that others no longer feel alone, and so he can advocate for changes in laws that may help other victims find justice and stop more abusers. Today, we're going to talk about the scourge of child abuse, the creative ways that law enforcement and prosecutors can work to take these people out of positions where they can harm others, the ability of potential offenders to make the choices that will prevent them from harming others, and why justice and having a voice is so important. So, Bob, I just wanted to thank you for coming on today. I had first heard your story from my friend Alice LaCour, who's one of the co-hosts of the Prosecutors podcast, and then jumped onto a live recording of their podcast to hear the tale, and I was blown away. I was impressed by a lot of things in the stories because I think that they're really big public policy issues and things that we need to think about around child abuse, child sexual abuse, around statute of limitations and the way that we pursue and prosecute those crimes. But I was just really taken aback. And I told Alice this, I was just taken back by the courage that you demonstrated as someone who, in my work, I've worked a lot with survivors of all sorts of abuse, and often, and I think you probably know this, we all have very different reactions to trauma. There is not, one for one particular kind, but a reoccurring theme I often hear among people who experience the high level of type of intimate abuse is that they just wish they could die, or they wish they could get away from it, or they, and the reality is it affects your life. But I don't see many people taking the kind of courageous steps that you did. So I was really impressed, and I'm glad she connected us. Really, I had just written Alice to say how impressed I was about your story, and she was like, Jason, you should have him on your show.
Well, thank you, Jason. I certainly appreciate it. It's been a long journey. Alice has been phenomenal, and congratulations to the new member of her family.
Yep, new little baby boy.
Yep. So actually, their podcast is coming out in a couple of weeks. We did it, and I was actually hooked up with them through Tim Tebow's organization. So
okay, I was going to ask how you made the connection to them.
Yeah, it was a friend of mine who actually knew several people over at the organization, and he's known my story for several years. And he says, "Look," he goes, "The time is now that we have to get this story told." And he put me in touch with a woman over on Tim's organization, and then we set up a meeting probably about 3 or 4 weeks later with the CEO of Tim's organization.
Obviously, your story, a big part of your story starts with the abuse that you suffered at the hands of your brother. But I always like to sort of just step back and ask people about what life was like before. We often focus a lot on, crimes that happen or the moment of trauma, but we don't focus much on what life was like before that. And I think that really helps us understand the impact. Where did you grow up, and what was your family like?
So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Lived in a 4-room rent-controlled apartment over a restaurant, so it wasn't a very big place. Um, and life was just a normal kid while my father was alive. And he had actually, it's pretty sad and keeps recurring to me. My dad came home one day um, having a heart attack, and he got on the couch and he was laying there. I was only 6 years old. And, back in those days, they had party lines on telephones. So, so I had picked up the line, and the other party was on the line, and I said, "Would you please hang up the phone because my dad is having a heart attack. We need to call the police." And the person wouldn't get off the phone.
Oh my
So
God.
there was a huge delay in the response, and things back then, and as we discussed earlier offline, I've been involved in emergency services and firefighting since 1973, and things were different back then. There was only a police officer with a resuscitator, and then they had to call an ambulance. But unfortunately and sadly, it was my dad's third heart attack, and he didn't make it. But prior to that, he and we had a great relationship. My oldest brother was in the Navy. My oldest brother Thomas, and he had moved to Chicago after he got married, which is another whole part of this story. And then my brother Bill, he was in the Navy. Well, he joined the Navy afterwards. He was in the Navy also. So after my dad passed away, things were pretty rough. But I had a great time with my dad. We used to go out like every Sunday. He would put me on the subway, and we'd go to the zoo. And then one day he took me up to the Bronx Zoo, which was a huge, great thing, and we go down to the firehouse, like, I don't know, twice a week. The firehouse was 2 blocks away, and I'd see
Oh,
him
neat.
go by my house. Yep, and wave to him all the time. I guess that's what got me involved.
And firefighting, yeah, and
Yeah.
emergency services. Well,
So things were pretty good, and then we can get into, if you want now or later, how my brother got involved.
yeah. Well, first, let me say I'm sorry for your loss of your dad. I found that it's never too late to take a moment to, to appreciate, people who are meaningful in our lives, particularly parents that we've lost. So I'm sorry for that loss. And
I appreciate that. Yep,
Yeah.
I got his picture up on the wall right here.
right. They never leave us, right? That's the beauty. My mom passed away last year, and
I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And obviously there's the sadness and the loneliness that comes with it, but there's also the appreciation. Just like I heard in your voice when you were talking about going to the firehouse with your dad or going to the Bronx. So you still have that appreciation for that person
Yep.
in your life.
Great memory.
What started to happen? What was life like once your dad passed away?
So it was pretty. It was pretty mundane. I was in grammar school. One thing, my mother had a very bad back, and she was bedridden for quite a while. So I would go to school, come home, cook, clean, do the laundry, everything else. So it got pretty busy for a while. My Aunt Loretta and Aunt Lillian would come over and give me a hand, but a lot of my childhood was taking care of my mom, and things were, it wasn't real rough, but it was different. So
Yeah, she struggled with loss of your dad, or
as in later experiences, she was not that great a person. So
Okay. So part of what you were dealing with when you were young, you mentioned you had to take care of her. Was she dealing with mental health things or just
She
yeah?
had a bad back, a very, very bad
Okay.
back. And there again, back in 1955, 56, the medical community isn't as good as it is now. So
Yeah, and that ends up being challenge. So you're the youngest child, it sounds like, right? You're the
that's
youngest
correct.
of the
Yeah,
3.
I'm the oops kid. My mother was my mother was 39 when she had me.
Oh, so you were unexpected.
Yeah,
You were unexpected. So when you're home alone at this point, both your brothers are off in the Navy, right?
right.
How did your brother how did he end up back home? You were mentioning just like
So he got out of the Navy. His enlistment was up, and he came home, and I was ecstatic. This was my older brother is coming home. I remember it was, I believe, in December. It was cold out, and I was just happy as heck for him to come home. So that's how he got home. He was single. He never married, and that's the beginning of this whole, I don't want to call it an adventure, but some type of evolution that started back then and lasted until about 5 or 6 years ago.
so you were saying that you were excited that your brother was coming home.
Yeah, it was
Um,
great.
yeah, because I imagine like you guys probably hadn't spent much time together when you were young. When did he go off to the Navy?
Let's see. So I think he got home in 57. So probably in 55. But I do remember he and my dad and myself would go out fishing together. So I do
Mm.
remember that before he went in the service. He was coming home to live.
So he was coming home simply to live with you guys and work. And so what eventually happened?
Okay, so he had a job with the phone company, New York Telephone, and things were going okay. Things I was happy. Things were fine. And then one night I went to bed and I felt something warm and wet where it shouldn't have been. My genitals, and I woke up and it was him.
Oh, wow.
Um, and he was we had bunk beds because it was a small apartment, so I was in the top bunk, he was in the bottom bunk. We shared a room. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he goes, it's okay, I'm your brother, so it's all okay. So that was the beginning of it, and that continued for quite a while.
And
It
so like
escalated.
in that moment, like as a young kid, like it sounds like you instinctively knew that something was wrong with what was happening. And that's like a very common thing for kids. You kind of know something doesn't seem right or this seems weird, but you don't really understand what's going on. Do you remember how you felt
Yeah,
in that
I
moment?
felt like surprised. Number one, to have this feeling going on, and the second one was like, "Get away from me! I don't want anything like this."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Whatever's happening, I don't want a piece of it.
Right,
And then, but he tried to kind of convince you that it was perfectly normal and that there is nothing wrong with it.
right. Yeah, he said, this is I'm your brother, and it's all okay, and I love you, and what did I know? I didn't know anything, but I found out real quick.
Right, that was problem. And you said this went on for years.
It went on until in different aspects, and like I said, there are many tangents to this story. It went on until I would say I was in high school when it finally got to a point where I was just bigger than him,
Mm,
and would resist anything that he tried to do. Um, so it went on for a while.
yeah, it just sounds like when you describe that story of the way that he, you know, acted when you first said, like, what's happening here, like it's almost like he had a rehearsed or prepared answer, or I guess that he was just really manipulative. Like,
Well, he definitely was manipulative. So he had a friend across the street that he used to, I'm assuming, had sex with, was another enabler that he would have call me on the phone and say he wanted to do this different things to me. And, I would tell him and tell my mom, and I don't know what's going on here. But at that point, too, I believe, and it was subsequent to this that we found out, but I believe he was had continued to do this in the neighborhood with other children, and I don't have any proof of that. But other than my nephew used to get beat up when he was growing up because they they called my brother. The neighbors called my brother Big Dick Bill, and he would abuse kids in the neighborhood. So I didn't know this until years later. Once this whole story evolved to a point where all the puzzle pieces starting to come together, it made a big picture.
so if I have this right, your brother would get the neighbor to call you. Is that
Yep.
so? He would get the neighbor to call you to convince you that this is okay. Like, this is
Right.
normal. This is what
And
people
to
do.
and to suggest that what he wanted to do to me.
Oh, goodness.
Yep.
Yeah. So 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 while that was happening, and I know that it's not always fair to kind of ask this question because it gets so complicated, and you may not have an answer to this question, but did you did you do you think your mom had any idea of what was happening either with you or your brother and the other kids in the neighborhood?
Absolutely, she did. My mother was an enabler. When I found out exactly how much she was involved, I was devastated. I mean, it was just like I just couldn't believe it. So it got kind of crazy.
How did you find out?
I always used to come home on leave to see my mother because I didn't want to be near my brother. I actually put him up against the wall one time and told him if he ever touched me again, I would kill him. In Navy uniform, believe it or not, I was in my Navy uniform. He tried something.
Mm.
Um, and so as things progressed and my nephew got involved, my cousin got involved, we knew that other people were involved, and the story started to snowball. One of the things that we found out through my oldest brother and through my sister in law was that my brother Bill was being investigated by Nassau County Police for an incident out at Jones Beach.
Mm.
Now, they investigated, came to his work, and in fact, there was a detective up there who I contacted years later to try and find out some information about it. But my brother Bill had given Thomas a box of stuff to keep in his basement, and he told him not to look at it. And this is what I'm finding out. This is probably 20 years later. So
Right.
I asked my brother, so well, what was in the box? He goes, I didn't look into it until I started to give it back to him. And he says there were pictures in there. There was not only child pornography, but there was pictures of Will having sex with my mother.
Oh
Oh,
my Lord.
yes, sir.
Oh
So
wow.
so that explained a lot of the stuff that was the enabling that was going on earlier in my life. And
Right.
and my poor nephew, who they used to babysit, was being abused from when he was just a tiny kid.
Oh my Lord. So it's funny about stories like this. Every time you think about who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, and sometimes it just feels as if you take the timeline back far enough, um, you know, you'll find like sadness and sorrow and horrible things that happen. Do you have any idea how the relationship between your brother and your mom started?
No, I have absolutely no idea. Now, I will say this, that when my brother Tom moved here from Chicago, he had told me a story about my dad telling him, uh, get out of the house as soon as you can. This was, I guess I must have been a baby. And then my oldest brother joined the Navy. That was during the Korean War. But he told me, he said, I remember this distinctly. He says, my dad told him, he says, get as far away from this house as you possibly can.
Mm.
So that is the only inkling that I ever had that something may have been going on, even as far back as that.
And so you're finding all of this out, I guess, when you're a young adult or in your 20s and 30s, as you guys are putting the pieces together. How did you end up talking to anyone about it? Do you remember you first told about it?
Well, it was kind of crazy. So I was in the service, and my nephew is 10 years younger than I am. And when I had come home on leave, just by chance, I had run into him because he had actually moved out. I mean, he was living somewhere else. And I said, Tommy, what's going on? And he started telling me about this. I'm like, oh my God! I said, I can't believe this. You know, he abused me too. But what they did to my nephew was 100 times worse than what he ever did to me. Um,
You said
so that,
they. What do you mean by they?
So Tommy, I'll say Tom is my oldest brother, and Tommy is my nephew. So
Okay.
we can have a distinction between the two of them.
Okay.
So Tommy had started telling me that his mother used to beat him, and that he was being abused at my house, at my mother's house apartment, and then he had said that my brother used to take him to New Jersey to a telephone building out there, and he had friends that would meet them out there and gang rape Tommy. Um, and other things. So he endured this for years and years and years. Um, Later on, that was how I found out about Tommy. And later on, my cousin Paul, who is now deceased, so Paul had come up. He was living in Florida. He and I were like brothers. We were very close. So he had come up to have his eye operated on at Will's Eye and was staying with us. So I had driven up to Will's Eye, and we had gotten out of there, and we're going to go down to Dover to the casino just to spend the afternoon and BS and stuff like that. So as we're driving down there, I told him, I said, you realize what my brother did, to me back then? And he goes, you? He goes, he did the same thing to me.
Calling all dog owners. Your furry friend deserves top-notch nourishment, and Ollie delivers the clean, fresh nutrition your dog needs in 5 flavors they'll absolutely flip over. Ollie is made in U.S. kitchens with ingredients carefully sourced from trusted growers and producers around the world, with absolutely no harmful fillers or preservatives. With protein-first recipes like fresh beef with sweet potatoes, fresh turkey with blueberries, or fresh lamb with cranberries, you might start thinking, dang, my dog eats better than I do. And that's probably true when it comes to Ollie. Give your pup a fresh start this new year by letting them taste test a personalized meal plan with Ollie. Head to ollie.com/Wondery. Tell them all about your dog and use code WONDERY to get 60% off your first box of meals when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a clean bowl guarantee on the first box. So if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's OLLIE.com/Wondery and enter code WONDERY to get 60% off your first box. Start your dog's new year off right with Ollie. Start your dog's new year off right with Ollie.
Weight loss. It needs to be fast and sustainable. Noom GLP-1 starts at just $149 and ships to your door in 7 days. Take it from Lauren, who lost 22 pounds on Noom.
If I come off of the GLP-1, it's not going to automatically make my weight yo-yo back.
$149 GLP-1s? Now that's Noom smart. Get started at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. Individual results may vary. Not all customers will medically qualify for prescription medications. Compounded medications are not reviewed by the FDA for safety, efficacy, or quality.
I'm like,
Oh, wow.
I'm like, what? So I pulled the car over. We had about a 3-hour conversation, and my cousin, he was married for 27 years. He never told his wife about it. So we
Oh,
had
wow.
gone into all the details that had happened to him. So as I explained before, we only lived in a little 4-room apartment. Paul would Paul would come and stay with us in the summer sometimes for a week or so. I would sleep on the couch in the living room. Paul would sleep in my bed, and not knowing that he was abusing Paul while I was sleeping on the couch. Uh,
Oh, wow.
yeah,
So,
I'm
yeah.
telling you, you can't believe this thing.
Well, and also I imagine like it's hard to talk about sexual abuse in general. It's hard to talk about childhood sexual abuse, and I think particularly it's hard for for men to talk about it. You know, I didn't mention this to you, but I was sexually molested by a family member when I was a child. And, you know, my parents handled it decidedly different than yours. I feel like they handled it well, even though they didn't feel like they did. And my brother also was affected by the same person. And actually the reason why, you know, and this is so much about my personality. I was just telling someone the other day that I have known my whole life that, you know, people attack me and it's like water off a duck's back. It doesn't
Yep.
bother me at all. But if you're going to catch me retaliating, I'm more likely to retaliate on behalf of other people. And I was thinking about it recently as I was talking out loud, and I realized it goes back to my brother. I've always been super protective of my brother. And so I had been dealing with it and I never said anything about it until I saw my cousin doing it to my brother. And then I told my parents. And you know, they sort of, I think, felt like they should have figured it out and they felt bad about it. But what I told them was, you know, you guys handled it perfectly. Like as soon as I said something, um, it was addressed. And I think the fact that my family addressed it led to enormous, enormous healing for me. And I can think of this moment where I ran into this person, the cousin in Washington, D.C. There was an event in Washington, D.C. And, you know, like I was actually at peace. And I think the reason why I was at peace was because they handled it so unbelievably um, well, but it's still hard to talk about. Like I find it hard to talk about right now as we're having this conversation. What was it like when you made the decision to talk to Tommy about it? Was there? I imagine it was deeply emotional.
It was because, Tommy kind of looked, especially after I got out of the service, he looked to me as a protector. I couldn't protect him. I wasn't home. I was gone for, 4 years, and I couldn't protect him. If I knew this was going on, I certainly would have stopped it immediately. Um, and then after I found out that my cousin was having problems, and we believed that through speaking with other members of the family, that he was involved with other members of the family. It was a funny thing that when my brother befriended people through his job who had children or whatever, all of a sudden they would just alienate themselves from him. So we always
Mm,
suspected that he was probably doing something. I have no proof of that, but when you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, the picture forms, and usually it's a good um, reflection as to what reality is.
yeah. And was it which one was it? Was it Tommy or was it Paul that you said was married for 27 years and didn't tell his wife?
Paul, it was
Paul.
Paul. So
So
the funny
yeah.
thing is that as soon as I got married, I told my wife, I told my wife, I told my children, I told everybody. I said, "Look, this is what happened. I'm not going to hide it. I'm not a perpetrator. I'm a victim." And at that point in time was when the investigation to try and get him stopped had already started. I mean, I went to Nassau County Police, and there were other incidences out in Suffolk County that the police were involved with my brother. Then we went to Delaware State Police. Then contacted the FBI. Then we contacted Boca Raton Police. No one. They treated us like criminal.
When did this happen? When did this period where you guys were trying to get it stopped?
So the initial period, I'm trying to think of when I went to, I found out about Nassau County Police when I told you that my brother was hiding, keeping some stuff for
The Bach.
the Bach. So I believe it was prior to that or just after. I think it was prior to that. My brother had my brother Will had purchased a house out in West Babylon. And I I was with the fire department. I get a call, and I know every policeman and everybody out there on the island. And I get a call from my mother, and my mother saying, "You got to come over here and help because the neighbors are going after your brother." I'm like, "For what? What's going on here?" So I creeps over from Deer Park to West Babylon, and written in shaving cream in the driveway was something to the effect of "Gay Bill, go home" or "Get out of here" or something like that. It was written in shaving cream. But I asked some of the neighbors. I went to some of the neighbors. I said, what's going on? I don't know what's going on. Well, evidently my brother was trying to get the kid who mows his lawn to come in the house and stay with him. I'm like, oh my God, here we go again.
Had you thought that maybe it had stopped? Had you ever had a conversation with Will about it after you became an adult?
No, absolutely not. And I know the reason that we had continued to pursue this is because we knew he would never stop. Our goal was to protect other children.
But did you guys have family events together and do things like that
We
that
did.
just stayed silent about all of it?
It did, because at that point in time, I didn't know my mother was involved. So we kind of kept everything on the down low.
You didn't want to hurt your mom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it was quite a shock later on that all the revelations were done at that point.
So once you guys find this box, you become concerned. Okay, there are more people. There's child pornography involved in this. There is something very strange going on with your mother and your brother. And so is that when you start reaching out to law enforcement? Is that how you found out about the Nassau County investigation?
It is. And Tom, my oldest brother, knew a councilman around the corner. He lived in Elmont, New York. And he had reached out to the councilman to try and see if there had been anything that resulted from the investigation out at Jones Beach, and never got an answer. The councilman really didn't do very much. So I reached out to Nassau PD through my sister-in-law and tried to contact Sergeant Lieutenant Lloyd Dobner, who was the case officer involved in the complaint. And he had retired. And from that point on, I couldn't find out very much more about the case other than the fact that I know that they never arrested him. So that's kind of where that was. Now, once Tommy and I had realized what was going on between us, we had reached out to NYPD and, told them our story, and nothing very much was done there. This all occurred in Brooklyn.
Would it have still been within the statute of limitations?
That's the problem. So, because later on, we had gotten very involved in the legislation to extend the statute of limitations on child abuse. And this went on for probably 2 or 3 years. Julie Rendelman, who was the attorney, our savior, she helped us with that. And I was working with a state senator up in the courts. And it was actually the Catholic Church who was holding up the legislation to allow suits and investigations and criminal charges be brought past the statute of limitations. So that was the sidebar that we were working on for quite a few years. It did get passed. That would have been probably in Well, from 2000, maybe early 2000s, all the way up through 2019, somewhere around there.
Because I remember, when the Child Victims Act
Yep.
was passed in New York that extended the statute of limitations and a lot of the controversy around that. But, some of the things that some of the great things about it is, before then, many survivors couldn't pursue any claims for damages on the civil side once sort of like a 5-year period expired, which is, crazy when it comes to child sex abuse, because often you can't even speak of it or you don't even know what's really happening until then. And, it really allowed you once it shifted, it allowed the clock to sort of start after you became an adult, and then until, what was it, like 55, but it provided a much broader period for claims. And then didn't it also, as I recall, it adjusted the statute of limitations? So, it used to, I believe the way that it used to work was like the statute of limitations kind of ended when the survivor of the sex abuse turned 23 or 24 or something like that. But now it increased it for felony offenses by 5 years. So it gave a lot more flexibility for people to get away from home, out of that environment, and then press charges.
And we were actually still beyond those statutes of limitations, even the revised ones. So we were kind of between a rock and a hard place. There was a dead end up there.
Yeah.
So in '82, when I moved down here to Delaware, I contacted Delaware State Police and told them about the situation, see if they could be of any benefit to us. And that they said no, since the crimes took place in New York, there was really nothing that they could do. So as things progressed, my cousin and I, Paul, he was living in Florida, and we said, well, look, this has got to stop. I mean, there's so much involved there. They had so many enablers. I mean, they sent me to a dentist who tried to abuse me, and my cousin and my nephew were just it just went on and on and on. It was like a giant snowball that kept getting bigger.
Sounds like a hellscape.
It was. We found out that there were physicians involved, lawyers involved. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff that we knew was going on. So my cousin Paul and I said, how are we going to stop this? This guy is never, ever going to stop abusing children. And we devised a way. He would look and I would look. We did find out that he was using through the internet, because you have to remember that prior to really the mid 2000s, 2015, there was no internet, so you couldn't get information anywhere. So now that the internet had opened up, we found out that he called himself Naked Willie on the internet.
Oh, how'd you figure that out?
My cousin had found something somewhere, I think from a site called Silver Daddies. I think that's where it was. Okay. So we said, all right, well, what we're going to do, we're going to establish an email account with a fictitious name. And the very, very first email that I sent to my cousin said that this email is being set up to help law enforcement investigate and hopefully prosecute this child abuser and molester and whatever else you want to call them. And that was a very important thing that we did, because we wanted that on the record that we weren't just, going along with him and he turned on us. So it was sometime later.
Right, because I can imagine a lot of prosecutors.
Yeah.
For example, if the internet service provider had caught, let's say, child pornography or sexual abuse materials, and you had tried to tell a prosecutor, "Oh, I was just trying to catch my brother, and look, I did," they would have been like, "Sure, we'll arrest both of you."
Exactly. And that's why we had the foresight to do this. Now, in between all of this, my nephew had already sent a letter to the FBI down in Florida explaining the interaction between this doctor down there, an attorney down there. I mean, it just.
How did you find out about the doctor, the attorney, and your brother?
Well, my nephew did. It was Tommy who found out all the relationships between the doctor, the attorney, and my brother. So he was kind of handling most of that end. Um, so we had set up this, and I had found it. We would be digging through the internet, like I would be on the phone with him for hours, my cousin Paul, and we go, "Did you find anything?" "No, I'm looking here, I'm looking there, I'm looking there." Well, eventually I found pictures of my brother on the internet on one of the sites, and I called Paul up and I says, I found it. I found pictures of him. So the person who was posting these pictures, I sent him an email and I said, I was looking at all your pictures and there's this one guy on there called Naked Willie and he's really nice looking and I really wish I could get in touch with him. Well, the guy put me in touch with him. That was like
Wow.
the biggest shot in the dark there, and
So he essentially connected you with your brother, but your brother had no clue that it was you. What were you guys? Had you guys in that interim period from that moment where the neighbors are spraying shaving cream in the driveway and your mom's calling them over, and that point where you connected with him online?
I was not going to stand for that anymore. So once we found out that he had this email address, we started corresponding with him, and there was all kinds of sexual correspondence with him. And then he started sending pornography, and he started to send child pornography. So my nephew Tommy, had gotten in touch with an attorney who used to be the former assistant DA in New York, Julie Rendelman, and Tommy and I had gone up there to see Julie, and she's just phenomenal. Just I can't say enough good about her. So Julie took this under her wing. She called NYPD right away, Brooklyn District Attorney, to try and see if anything could be done. Nothing could still be done. So we continued this for a while, but Julie had said she had a contact at the FBI. So to put this in a nutshell, so Julie had contacted the FBI and said that what we were doing, and nothing happened. This was probably in October 2018 or 19. I forget exactly which year it was. So nothing had happened. So 2 months go by. I called Julie up again because he had sent child pornography to me. I forwarded it to Julie. Julie's like, "What is this?" I said, "I don't know because I didn't open it. I had no ideas in it." I says, "I don't want to open it." So Julie at that point, let me go back. Let me regress just one thing because this is important. So after this was going on, I reached out to my daughter and son-in-law who had been aware of everything. In fact, I said everybody in my family knew exactly what was going on the entire time. And they had tried to reach out to get the FBI involved. My congressman down here reached out to try and get the FBI involved. So we didn't hear anything from the FBI for a while. So in January, the FBI had called us and said, "Look, Julie had called us and we're investigating this." Now, during this time, we had even reached out earlier to the Boca Raton Police Department and said, "Look, this guy's on your radar." Now, this was 3 people.
And he was living there at the time in Boca Raton?
Yes, he's living in Boca Raton. So not only did Paul call up and make a complaint, I made a complaint. My nephew made a complaint. They treated us like we were trash. They treated us like we were criminal.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by they treated you like criminals?
They seemed like they didn't want to take the time to even speak with us. We said we would come down and interview with you. We said this guy is living here. We gave him the address. And I said, just if nothing can be done, at least keep an eye, put him on the radar or something. So in one of
And I was reading, like, during some of these conversations, I recall, like, you mentioning that you guys had discovered, like, you were communicating back with him, and you'd even discovered that he was planning on a trip to visit 3 Florida theme parks at once.
what really escalated the action, because we called Julie up again and said, look, he's sending emails saying that he's going to Disney World and the other theme parks, and he hangs out in the boys' bathroom and looks at them. I mean, he put it in an email. And then in one of the emails, he even said that he was abusing his brother's son from Chicago. It could only be one person. That's Tommy. So
Wow.
in these emails, he made confessions to different things. So I got in contact with Julie again. I said, Julie, I said, he said he's going to Disney World, and we're really concerned about it. So she called the FBI, contact the FBI again, and said, hey, if somebody gets abused, or again, this is on your head. We've told you now about it. Because also in these emails, he would say that he would be looking at his neighbor's 4-year-old kid and fantasizing about them. And, it just went on and on and on. So Julie called the FBI, and it called me, and I can't remember exactly if it was January or February. It might have been February. And I said, look, why don't you take over this email account, because I really don't want it anymore, and you guys can use it. So I filled out the forms, and the FBI took over the account. I didn't hear from him for a while, and I believe it was April 1st, or might have been March 31st. I received a call and said that they raided his apartment at 7 o'clock that morning, and interviewed him in a trailer down in the parking lot.
It's wild to me to think that someone in the 1950s, right? 1950s is sexually abusing people inside of his family in the neighborhood, to the point where he's getting beat up and neighbors are sort of like ransacking your house, that he's clearly doing it to family members beyond that, but not until, what is that, 60 years later, before law enforcement actually has an interaction with him. Why do you think it took so long?
Right after I had spoken to Tim's organization and Alice, there was a scathing report about the FBI in the past not investigating or taking seriously child abuse accusations. I couldn't believe that. I was reading this article saying this is exactly what went on. So when they raided my brother's apartment, Boca Raton police were with the FBI, and they had our 3 complaints with them when they raided his apartment.
So the notebooks were still open when you guys were talking, and they were
right
keeping track of it. So
right.
Once the FBI contacted them, they went to go look to see what they had.
Yep.
One of the interesting things for me, and I know you're doing some advocacy now, is that one of the problems that I find with child pornography and child sexual abuse materials, which I sort of separate, because there is, you've got sexual abuse materials that exist in videos and pictures and all sorts of things. And then child pornography, where you're just taking pictures or taking advantage of some of that situation, equally dangerous, equally bad things. But so many offenders, and I think there's some people today, at least on the pornography part that doesn't involve sexual abuse, who minimize it. And there seems to be like growing conversations about like how, we prosecute too hard on those kinds of cases. And I think a lot of people don't know that there's this sort of movement of voices in that direction. But the reality seems to be, when I read a lot of those cases that involve prosecuting someone for child pornography, it involves a lot. Some of it originated as child abuse, but they're often going after somebody who they know has done many more things than just that. And I'm just curious, from your perspective, do you think that there's an element to society that is not taking it as seriously, like
Oh,
that piece?
absolutely. Absolutely. I have no doubt. I can tell you that when I came down here and tried to advocate for some of the organizations that supposedly were helping people who were abused, and I was brushed off. I said, "I'll do it for free. I'll come out and talk to everybody. I will help you out in any way." And I found that two of the three organizations just here in Delaware, they wanted photo ops and money, and that's it. You know, and I kept trying to explain. I said, "Do you realize how many victims out there have no voice, especially older victims who have held this in for so long and have told no one about it and have no outlet about it, who would just dying to be able to speak to somebody openly and help them heal." And that was my
Yeah.
goal. That's my goal today. But yes, truly believe. I think there's an underground society, and we did find out because of the doctor, the lawyer, the dentist. There is an underground, I wouldn't say organization, but just an underground cult that exists everywhere. And it's not unique to New York, or it's just everywhere.
Well, I was recently, doing some interviews and covered this case, Delphi murders out in Delphi, Indiana, and one of the victims, two girls, one named Libby Germain and Abby Williams, and they encountered a man on a bridge who kidnapped them, murdered them. In his confessions, he had said that his intent was to sexually assault them. And one of the things that baffled people about the case was that as the investigators investigated it, there were reports of, two other sex offenders or people who are interested in child pornography contacting this one girl, Libby, and people were just baffled by how could so many sex offenders end up contacting one girl. And I kept on thinking to myself, I think people underestimate how many offenders are out there, or people who are just on the edge of offending.
Oh yeah, yeah. And what happens? I think in what you said, that they would contact someone who was already abused. They, in their mind, may look at it that the victim actually liked it or enjoyed it, and or may be an easy target for them because they know that most likely they wouldn't say anything.
Yeah, because the biggest barrier has been crossed. Because I think that's one of the problems too about child abuse in general. And you gave that example of Tom, who was taken out to New Jersey, and there were multiple guys involved in the assault. That once someone knows that a child will be silent, that they take that, and not fairly, but they take that as an invitation because they view this as a vulnerable person who will not raise their hand. But there's something worse about your story in my mind when I think about it, particularly for you, that not only was your brother taking advantage of you, he knew that the one person you could go to, your mom, was also in the middle of this too.
Right.
So like, you didn't even know it, but you didn't even really have an outlet.
I had no outlet to go to. The only outlet I had, that person that really helped me quite a bit, because at this point in time, I was about 17 in high school. I had a girlfriend, and I used to tell her about what was going on. So she was kind of an outlet for me and helped me out quite a bit in coping with this. But if we wanted to just go forward from where he went was rated. Um, that
I
might
did want to ask you one thing though. Did you ever talk to your mom about it?
Nope. And when my mom passed away, I had no dealings with them whatsoever. When my mom passed away, I was in Vienna, Virginia. I was working for Northern Telecom at that time. I was down there on a business trip, and my friend had called me and said, "Your mom passed away." I never went to her funeral. I never shed a tear. I never did anything. To this day, I've never
Oh,
had any
wow.
contact. Yeah. So
But you were
what?
saying, yeah.
Once I found out how much of the circle of enabling that they were involved in, I just didn't want anything to do with them.
Well, and then when you get down and find out about everything that's going on with your brother in Florida, it must have been like a nightmare repeating itself, because here's another circle of people who are enabling
Exactly.
behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's how you saw the monster in the closet.
Well, I had heard that there's that William was called the monster in the closet. How did he get that name?
My cousin and I gave him that because as we spoke about him, we said, you know what he is? He's a monster in the closet, and to this day, the door opens every once in a while, and the monster comes out, and you have to have a coping mechanism to put that monster back in the closet. My cousin had told me he was at a pool party one time, just out there having a couple of drinks, having a good time. And he says the monster came out. He says my whole demeanor changed. He had called me up and we talked, and we got the monster put back in the closet. But it's basically this would be the same thing for almost everybody who's abused. That monster is always going to be with them, regardless of how old they are.
And that was also part of the thing I was thinking about, that so often people they're afraid that something's going to happen or break, or if they talk about it, or if that they think that if they don't talk about it, it'll go away, but it never does really go away. It's always with you.
It's always with you, as you know, and so we were really pretty happy when we found out that the FBI raided the apartment. They interviewed him in a trailer, evidently in his parking lot down at his condo in Boca. And at first he denied everything, and then he admitted it. And they arrested him. I mean, he had numerous hard drives with child pornography on it. I mean, they charged him with 2 counts, dropped the 1 count, and he was pleaded guilty on the other one. But they said hundreds of child pictures on his hard drives.
Wow. And so from there, the case proceeded pretty quickly. He didn't fight the charges?
No, he pleaded guilty. Well, once he admitted to the FBI in the trailer, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of child pornography and made a plea deal with the government of 5 years incarceration.
Yeah, and my understanding was they made this deal for 5 years of incarceration, but for you, your nephew Paul, and Tommy, also your cousin Paul, and also Tommy, your nephew, you all gave victim impact statements that caused the judge to just pause the process and step off the bench for 3 hours. And ultimately the judge came back, declined the recommendation of 5 years, and sentenced William to 8, which is near the top of the sentencing guidelines. What was it that you guys said in your impact statements?
One of the things that I had said, which was most important to me, and this is across the board, is that when a child is born and a child is young, They look to us for everything, for protection, for food, to hold them when they're sick. And these people violate that trust that's given to these children, and they take away. They give us a life sentence. I mean, he might have got 8 years, but he gave us all a life sentence, and that was just something from the heart that I needed to get out. Uh, and you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. All six of the FBI agents that helped us were in the courtroom at that time too. It was really a surreal setting. And Tommy, Tommy just gave his impact statement about how he would take him to New Jersey and what he did and how horrible he was, and how my nephew has been suffering from PTSD ever since. Luckily I've come out of it pretty sane, although a few of my friends wouldn't say that. but but I've come out.
Who among us is truly sane?
But it was my family. It was my family and the support and the encouragement that got me through it and continue to this day to get me through it. And at the sentencing, it was, as I said, surreal. And he got up. Got up.
So that was the first time you had seen him in years, face to face. Okay.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
And he had gotten up and he says, "Well, I pleaded guilty to the child pornography thing, but I love my family and I really didn't do any of the stuff that they're saying." Yeah. my nephew and I says, "I'm like 69 years old. He's 59 years old. Do you not think that we had something better to do with our lives than come to court in Florida and try and put you in jail?"
Right.
Right. So the judge, when the judge disappeared for 3 hours, nobody could figure out what was going on.
Because people may not know, that is usually not that odd, because usually judges are walking in, either whether they've gone through a trial or they've read pre-sentencing reports, they've got a pretty good idea by the time they get to victim impact statements how they want to rule. But clearly something about these statements just took the judge aback.
It is, and she was really great. And here's the crazy thing. So in his appeal and in his plea to the court, the only thing that he wanted out of this was that after he got out of jail, that he be allowed to look at pornography.
What do you mean? What did he say?
Because part of the sentencing was that he's not allowed to look at any pornography, whether it be child, adult, or anything, and that the probation officer will monitor, anything that he has, all of his personally owned devices. But in his appeal, when I read his appeal, and what he said at the sentencing was, I want to be able to watch pornography. I'm a single old man, and I want to be able to watch pornography. We sat there in disbelief. Hey, really? That's
wow.
There are some things that leave me speechless, and that was one of them.
I'm sure it left his attorney speechless too.
Yeah.
Wow.
Crazy. Yeah. So
and he lost his appeal, right? Because he was appealing the sentence out of an argument that your victim impact statements didn't have to do with the child pornography that he had pled guilty to. The courts ruled essentially that the judge has the power to consider all sorts of factors when it comes to sentencing, mitigating factors, but also aggravating factors, including other bad acts that a person takes. And, so when I heard about his appeal and I was reading the appeal, I was like, this is destined to fail. If he was trying to keep this out of a trial, possibly he could have done that. But, the victim's impact statements, it's a valid space for that. Did you feel like any kind of sense of relief to be able to tell your story in a public forum like that and in front of him? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great deal of relief. And thanks to you and Alice and Tim Tebow's organization, we're able to get the story out. I mean, my goal eventually, I mean, my dream, I'm not a kid anymore. I'm 74 years old, but my dream would be to be able to go throughout the country and talk to people and give lectures and be able to touch people who were victims, especially older victims, because they suffered for so long and don't know how to cope with them. And just to get out there and help people cope with the stuff that they've been hitting brick walls like we did for 50 years, you know?
Right. And William, he's scheduled to get out in February of
Yep.
2025. Are
Yep.
you worried that even after 8 years of incarceration for this, that are you concerned about him reoffending, and are you worried about other children, or do you and do you think that there's like anything that can be done in a situation like this where, you know, an offender who habitually for decades and decades and decades has done this kind of either child abuse or child pornography, what can we do, you know, like when the sentence runs out, what can we do to protect ourselves and communities from someone like your brother?
Well, I think getting the word out into the community that he's going to be living in, that's number one. If we can get the word out, speaking to people, that would be great. But I think his probation officer is going to have a difficult time, keeping tabs on him. We all agree. Everybody in my family agrees that I believe, as long as his health permits it or whatever, I don't think he'll ever give it up. And that's the unfortunate thing. And so we do live with that fear that some other person, some other child, it's just so odd. I mean, a kid walking down the street, he might have, these thoughts of, and to me, it's just disgusting. Um,
Is there something that we should be thinking about from a public policy perspective about differentiating, you know, a one-time offender when it comes to child abuse or child sexual abuse from a a habitual offender? And I say this because, you know, I don't, I guess we don't really know your brother's story, and we don't know what happened to him, and we don't know what shaped him into who he is. But, you know, clearly the evidence suggests that this is habitual behavior and is driven by something deeper than, you know, than something that it's driven by something so deep that either he just doesn't want to give it up, or he can't bring himself to stop. Because I think there's a choice, right? You can have whatever thoughts and feelings you have, and they could be thoughts and feelings that could lead to harm for other people, but you do still have a choice. But when we're dealing with somebody who's demonstrated that, and I'm not saying that the choice is easy, because I've worked with people who have pedophilic thoughts and who have come in to get help because they don't want to offend. And I know how hard it is, right? I know how hard it is. And I find them courageous, actually. I find it unbelievably courageous that a human being will walk into a room with a person who is not a pedophile and say, I need help, so I don't do this, right? To me, that is unbelievably courageous. But we also know not everyone is going to be that courageous.
and I do agree with that. I do agree with that. I think that, well, number one, everyone has a choice. We have a choice in what we do, and I think that each person has to look at themselves and see what their inner strengths are, because some people are weak, some people are stronger. Luckily, I was stronger. Um, and yes, I do agree that if someone knows that they have these urges and seeks help through mental health professionals or whatever, if they get out there and say, look, I don't want to do this. I'm having these thoughts. I don't know what to do. I think that that's totally different from someone who actually acts their thoughts out, most definitely.
Yeah, and I think for someone like your brother, like, should we have longer sentences for people like this? Should we have more restrictions? Like, what is the solution to protect the next Bob that encounters someone like your brother?
So yes, I do think that there should be longer sentences for people like him because he has demonstrated this behavior over decades. So yeah, he should be put away for much longer than 8 years. Um, I think the other portion of it, a couple of different ways. One, that we need to get out and have a vehicle where, and maybe not a professional vehicle in a clinical setting, but someone who they can relate to, someone who's gone through it, and someone who they can openly speak to. I think that would be very beneficial. The other thing that I find in society today is a society of pervasiveness where people are kind of like into doing whatever they're doing to themselves, or going to a baseball game or whatever, that they push aside the possibility that this could ever happen to their kids. And I think that the awareness has to be brought out better through media, and they're starting to do a better job. But I think, as that article stated about the FBI, that law enforcement needs to take these complaints more seriously than what they do. And they're facing challenges also because, number one, it's very difficult to prove these cases. And number two, most police departments are understaffed and overworked right now. So caseloads are certainly significantly higher than I believe what they were, back when all of this started. So there are obstacles and challenges across the board. But what I don't like are politicians and agencies who pretend that they're going out to help people, and all they want are photo op, or to raise more money, or whatever. My cousin, myself, my nephew, we never sued my brother. We never asked for anything monetarily, and to get money out of him or anything. We just want to make sure that he doesn't do this to anybody else. That's the motivation behind this. And I think that more people need to be aware. There's no awareness out there about anything. And in society today, especially given the situations of crime rising all over the place, we need to make people aware of predators that are out there, that people that are kidnapping kids and throwing them in the back of a truck. I think all of that needs work. Um, and it's going to take a lot of work the willingness. That's the willingness of these agencies and media to concentrate and save these kids.
Yeah. What got you through? Like, what got you
My
through?
family,
Yeah.
100%. It was my family.
Yeah.
I can openly talk about this with my two daughters, with my wife, people who need to hear the story, because once that once that had got out that we were doing some podcasts and stuff, people wanted to hear the story. So I've recounted it a few times, several times in the last couple of months. So, not that it's easy for me to speak about it, but I think it's necessary for me to speak about it, because if I don't, then I would have gone back to 1955 and not say anything, in my own mind. So I'm a big believer. If you see something or know something, say it and get it out to somebody who can help you.
And it's like you said before, it's about being able to have a voice and creating an environment where people can have a voice. And I wonder, like, in thinking about all of this as we start to close, like, what is your kind of like hope and dream for like the little kid right now who is the young Bob, who's in this kind of situation and doesn't know what to do or what's happening. What do you, if you could imagine sort of like that perfect, I guess there's nothing perfect once it happens, but if you could imagine sort of like your dream for them, what would you hope for them?
I think that the most important thing is that they can seek out someone they can tell and trust. Maybe not in the family, maybe a teacher, maybe a friend. In smaller children, that case is much more difficult. But I will say this, and I have run across children who have done this. There are kids that I know that have gotten up in the middle of their class and said, "Oh, my daddy did this or my daddy did that," and that's the truth. I mean, I couldn't believe that they would say that, but when a child says that, don't initially assume that they're lying or imagining or whatever. There are signs. You can look at a child, a kid, and tell if there's something wrong. If a child doesn't want to, might be reluctant to go someone. I mean, look at the Menendez case that just came out.
Mm-hmm.
The father would tell the family, if the door is closed, don't come down the hallway. And he was abusing these kids. So there are signs, and unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that little children can do. If you're older, I think once you reach 5 or 6 or 7, I think it's very important that we get that word out in schools and stuff. If something is wrong, come and say about it. Now, I'm not saying that they should do that all the time, because we don't want parents or guardians or caregivers to be accused falsely either. So there's a,
But
there's a
but I think you're getting at the idea for a child, while it may seem simple to us, they need to have the knowledge that it's wrong. They just need
right,
to know that it's wrong. So
right,
if it happens, or I can think of other situations from my childhood where you hear about it happening to someone else. I remember this with a neighbor family where one of the girls in that family came to mention something to one of my family members that alerted my mom to abuse that was going on, and then action was taken. But if that little girl hadn't known that there was something wrong, and then my family member who was also young didn't know that there was something wrong with that, my mom would have never found out, and my mom would have never been able to do anything. And in that particular circumstance, my mom hunted down the father who was divorced from the mother in the house and called him. And that day, every kid in that house was gone. That day, he took every kid out of that house.
good.
And I think, like, if in that daisy chain, everyone who heard about that on the way to it making to my mom didn't know, if all those kids that were involved didn't know that there was something wrong, then they wouldn't have even known to tell an adult. And God bless them for having the courage to tell an adult too.
Right, exactly. I mean, my brother would have, I would have friends over from grammar school, and my brother would expose himself to them. I mean, stuff like that. We would go away on vacations where I would be made to sleep in the same bed as him, and he would try something, and I would go to my mother's room and say, I don't want to sleep with my brother. Well, that should have been like number one red alert,
Light bulbs, right? Yeah. What is going on here?
Right.
Um,
So,
yeah. So for you, what's in terms of, it sounds like where you're headed with this is building awareness. And I just want to say, like, I find your story and your courage absolutely powerful. I know you said you want to travel around and you want to talk to it. I think it's awesome. I think that idea, particularly being able to reach out to older men who have been keeping these secrets for decades, and
or women.
and women, and allowing them to have a voice is unbelievably powerful. But I also think you should put pen to paper and write a book. because I think that there are going to be people who are going to have the strength and courage to walk into the room or go to an event. And then there are other people who aren't ready, but if they have, something printed on their Kindle or a printed book, that may be an outlet for them. So that's my 10-cent thought.
Well, I agree with you. In fact, that's the feedback that I get with everybody. In fact, Alice said the same thing, that they're going to try and put together a package so I could see if I could get it written in a book. I'm not a great writer. I started to write something years ago, and it just didn't go anywhere. But yes, but to be able to see in my mind, especially like I said with the older victims, if they can see someone face to face and maybe put their hand on the shoulder and say, look, it's okay. You're a victim. You didn't do anything wrong. I think that's very powerful.
I agree. Well, thanks a lot, Bob. I really do appreciate it. I am also a writer, by the way. So when you need reviewers, feel free. I'm happy to take a look at it. And just keep up the fight. And I think you're an example, and hopefully there are people out there. I have no doubt, knowing my listeners, that there are people out there who need to hear this story and need to hear this message. And, I have a very broad variety of listeners, and I'm sure that there are older people in my audience who have never told anyone and have never had a voice. And I hope this gives them the courage to have a voice. And there are younger people in my audience who are probably going through abuse right now. And I hope this gives them a chance to have a voice and reach out to help. So thank you for coming. I appreciate you being so vulnerable and willing to talk about it. It sets a good example. So.
I appreciate it, Jason. Very much so. This has been a long journey, and without Tim's organization and Alice and you, I'd still be back, running a quarter mile from the beginning, So.
I don't know that that's true, but I'm sure we're all glad to be a part of it. So,
well, thank you, Jason. I appreciate it so much, and you be well and be safe.
Yeah, you too. You too. Thanks for joining us today. If you'd like to join us and other listeners for more discussions, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. I'd encourage you guys all to join. It's a great group. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.